commentator, Maya Goodfellow, author and commentator, and Robert Taylor, the Telegraph columnist. As I say, 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask them a question.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Welcome to you all. Apologies that you're all remote and not with me in the studio. I'm sure those days will come back very, very shortly. James is in Watford with our first question. Hi, James.
Good evening and Happy New Year. Does the panel recognise my right to damage or remove a public statue or monument if I deem it to be offensive?
Robert Taylor. You're muted, Robert.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question. No, you don't, quite frankly. We all have our own political opinions on lots of statues, lots of portraits, lots of public figures, whether they be historical or not. To go around deciding individually or in a group which of those you feel should be standing and which should be taken down is completely inexcusable. It's up to society as a whole. It's up to democracy. If the people feel that statues need to be taken down, fair enough. But 4 of you or 8 of you or 100 of you together just deciding on a hoof that one statue goes against your principles, no, I don't think that's right. And I am rather surprised by the judgment of the court on the case of the Colston statue. I think it's very strange, sets a bad precedent.
Well, we weren't in court, obviously. We didn't hear all of the evidence, but you're right James is right on the face of it. It does send a message to others who want to do similar things that there might not be any consequences for their action. Now that, Andrew Adonis, is surely not a message that a court should be sending.
Well, I actually agree with Robert that these should be social decisions, by which I mean they should go through the normal political process. It is extraordinary that Edward Colston, who was a notorious slave trader, who traded tens of thousands of slaves, that was the main source of his fortunes. It wasn't even as if it was in the context of the time, kind of just one of many things going on. He was one of the leading slave traders of the Restoration generation. It is extraordinary that Bristol City Council hadn't removed the statue a long time ago. This goes to the heart of the debate we're having at the moment. I think a part of the reason why is because there hadn't been much of a debate about it. Most people, I wager actually, Iain, that you probably, and indeed I didn't fully know who Edward Colston was until the controversy about the removal of his statue. What it did was to expose the fact that one of the leading benefactors of the city of Bristol and one of the most honoured city fathers of the city, almost his entire fortune was based on the trading of African slaves. So, and that was clearly a big issue with the jury. Now, when Robert says that he was surprised that the court made this decision, juries, of course, make these decisions and have complete liberty to do what they think in the fullest sense of the term is justice. And justice involves accordance with conscience, as well as the words written down on the pages of the law. And it looks to me, I obviously wasn't in the jury room, as if on the issue of was this criminal damage, which is what they were being charged with, the Colston 4, did it amount to criminal damage? It looks as if the jury took the view that because the statue was of an out-and-out criminal, it wasn't fair to judge the removal of the statue itself to be criminal. And the better thing, coming back to where Robert started, would have been if Bristol City Council had removed the statue some time ago. And other really out-and-out slave traders and people who I think we would all accept, and even in the context of the time, most middle opinion people thought what they were doing was unacceptable, that we should as a society take the decision not to honour these people.
Dr. Maya Goodfellow, what do you think about this? Because I wonder how many of us would have thought yesterday that a jury would have made this decision.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't clear that this would be the outcome, and I agree with Andrew Adonis that it's sort of telling that this statue was still in place, and actually there was, albeit not huge, but there was resistance to the statue still being up in the years preceding it then being pulled down right after the Black Lives Matter protest. So I think the sort of context of this does matter, and we need to make sure that there are decent democratic sort of processes if people want to campaign to remove particular individuals. And in this instance, Edward Colston is someone who did, as has been mentioned, make huge amounts of money off of trading the slave trade. The company that he was involved in enslaved over 84,000 Black men and women and children, and 19,000 of those people died in the sort of process of transporting the slaves. So I think that this context really, really does matter. But one of the things that one of the lawyers representing one of the individuals said is that this was a case of the jurors hearing all the evidence and then coming to a decision that wouldn't be right to convict these people who removed the statue of this man who's essentially glorified slave trader. And I think there's sort of a broader discussion to be had here. Maybe this is a really unpopular thing to be saying about statues. We do have these sort of quite febrile national conversations about statues. And I'm actually of the mind, perhaps somewhat controversially, that often these statues of individuals don't look that good. I don't think they actually reflect British history so well. I'm not tied to any kind of statues of individuals, whoever they may be. So I think we could maybe have an interesting discussion about how useful it is to sort of remember the past in this way at all. But I suppose that's not necessarily where the debate's going to get at the moment.
Well, I've seen a couple of tweets, one of which I've got here saying, well, when does the George Washington statue in London come down? Would I get into trouble if I tried to prevent people from taking it down? Because, of course, George Washington, considered an American hero, but was a slave owner. You look at the statue outside the Houses of Parliament of Oliver Cromwell. Well, I'm sure a lot of Irish listeners would quite like that one to come down. It's very difficult to draw the line, isn't it? Because all five of us speaking on this programme now would probably have a different line to draw, Maya.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's why I am of the mind that I'm not particularly tied to having statues of any individuals. That doesn't mean we don't have memorials. That doesn't mean we don't remember the past. I'm not entirely sure personally what function it serves. I don't think it's that useful a way of understanding British history and the complexities of that history. And so one of the things about this is one of the complexities of having these statues of individuals is that things do change. Attitudes change and what is acceptable changes. And so often these statues do feel out of date. And I'm not convinced that as a way of remembering the past, it's that useful. But I realise that is probably a deeply unpopular opinion that not that many people agree with.
I wonder whether the solution is not to take down the statues, but put up some sort of educational plaque to explain who that person was. And in today's society, we look at them in a different way. I think otherwise they kind of get consigned to history. And I mean, nobody in Bristol, apart from seeing Colston's name maybe on some street names, would have any idea of what his background was. Maybe the solution there was to put some sort of plaque up. Rakib Ehsan, what's your view on this?
I think that's a very interesting alternative that should be discussed more. The idea of adding a plaque to statues of controversial figures, as we've said, that Edward Colston was an active participant of the slave trade and he made a great deal of money out of it. But overall, I would make the point that the overwhelming majority of British people, they do not consider the tearing down of statues as a legitimate form of political protest. I've done research on that. I commissioned polling, and that was one of the main questions of the survey. I feel that if we're talking about removing statues from the public space, that should be done through local community consultation processes. Then actually what you do, you generate debates and discussions about controversial historical characters. So there's almost that educational public awareness dimension. And if the democratic processes are followed and the decision is removing a statue from the public space, then at least you can say that is a proper way of going about it in a liberal democracy, as opposed to relying on unruly activists to remove that statue.
Well, it is. And of course, that happened in Bristol. This was discussed for, I think, 5 years. And of course, there is a black mayor of Bristol. So you would have thought that this might have been able to be solved through the local council, through the local mayor. But the discussions lasted a long time. Maya, you want to come in?
Well, just really quickly, and I don't know all the specific details of this, but I was reading in the reporting around this earlier that actually there was a discussion about trying to have a plaque that really did state what Edward Colston's involvement in the slave trade was, but then there was disagreement about exactly what the plaque would say. And so the article that I was reading was saying that there was a sort of agreed upon text, but then there was some kind of intervention by Bristol Society of Merchant Venturers, I don't know what that organisation is, who disagreed with the wording of the plaque. They wanted to water it down, this article said. And then Marvin Rees, who is the mayor, responded by blocking the installation. So there wasn't even an agreement about what should go on that plaque. And so I guess this is one of the problems of saying, stick up a plaque and then we'll be able to contextualize it and understand it, is there isn't always an agreement about what some of these people have done in history and what the wording on the plaque should be. And so that's why I think at times you get to activists saying we've had enough and we've tried these different measures and we don't want to see the slave trader we don't want to have to walk past the slave trader, the statue of the slave trader in our city every day.
Some biting political satire from Steve on a text saying, after the Colston 4 verdict, I think maybe Prince Andrew needs to change his legal team. Ooh, dangerous territory there, isn't it? Right. Thank you very much indeed for your answers, James. I think given what you asked, I think we know what your view is on that. Thank you very much. Let's go to Alex in Watford. Hello, Alex.
Good evening. What is the panel's view of how to tackle inflation?
Oh, now that's one we could spend the rest of the hour on, I guess. Rakib, let's come to you first.
I think that it's obviously a very, very difficult question to answer. I think that one thing that I've been focusing on particularly of late is the energy bills. And I think that it's very clear that that should be a government priority. I think more generally, we are moving towards a cost of living catastrophe for many families, to be perfectly honest, and that should be prioritised by the Conservative government. I think that I heard, Iain, that one of your previous callers before we started Cross Question was talking about the combination of stagnant wages, the national insurance contribution rise, and those rising energy bills. So I think that it's almost creating the perfect recipe in its sense for a real cost of living squeeze. I think that,
and do you think it is the government's role to interfere there and say, well, look, we recognise this is happening, so we are going to introduce measure X, Y or Z to help people at the bottom of the income scale? We've been talking about energy costs. Labour want them to abolish VAT on energy, which probably would benefit everybody taking part in this programme tonight, but I'm not sure that that's really the point, is it?
No, I think that maybe talking about the expansion of the warm homes discount, I believe that would be helping the more deprived sections of society. But by scrapping, as you said, by scrapping the 5% VAT, that would be benefiting people who are fairly comfortable in society. I think that even though I'm not sure the government would entertain this because of their commitment to COP26 and environmental policies in general, I do feel perhaps the suspension of environmental levies on energy bills is something that they should entertain. So that there are ways of going about it. It's the matter of whether or not that really fits in with the broader government agenda. But the priority really should be trying to assist the very poorest in society. And how do we really address the almost the sort of forthcoming cost of living squeeze?
Maya Goodfellow, how do you think we should tackle inflation? I mean, it does seem to be something that's happening in most countries around the world, certainly in Europe. Is it something that an individual government can do an awful lot about?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And thinking about both inflation and the cost of living, the discussion that's just been going on, I think governments need to have long-term plans, like thinking about long-term industrial strategies. And given the UK's history in relation to thinking about the industrial strategy, there's obviously a real need there. And I think that one of the things in terms of short-term measures, and one of the things that's really concerning in relation to the cost of living and thinking about energy bills that was just mentioned, is that not only do we have a number of different areas that are quite clearly there's major issues in terms of cost of living rising, whether that is energy bills, whether that is food prices. We also have had a rolling back of social security net. So not only this cut to universal credit after it was increased for a very short period of time, but we've had 10 years of cutting parts of the safety net for people. And what we know is that the vast majority of people who are in poverty are actually in work. And so taking away that support for people who are working but aren't being paid a decent wage is really just plunging more people into poverty. And so whilst the government needs to be planning sufficiently for things like a decent long-term industrial strategy, one that tackles the climate crisis, investing further in renewables and things like solar energy and wind farms, they also need to be looking at the immediate, which is the fact that so many people have been plunged further into poverty, not only in the past 10 years, but now because of this decision they've made over universal credit. It's not good enough to say that people need to just get a job because work isn't paying. And so they need to be making sure that work pays as well. So I think there's a number of areas that they could be looking at, not least given the sort of impacts of the pandemic on people's pay packets.
I'm going to come to Robert and Andrew in just a moment, but first a text from Matthew who says, love you and love the show. Well, thank you very much, but please could you find the time to recap on who your guests are for those of us who join part way through? I'm about to do that. Lord Andrew Adonis, Labour peer, former Cabinet Minister under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Dr Maya Goodfellow is author of Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, and a visiting research fellow at the University of Sheffield. Robert Taylor is a journalist, commentator and Telegraph contributor, and Dr Rakib Ehsan is research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and a political commentator. We'll hear much more from them in a moment, and we'll take more of your calls on 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
20 past 8. Alex in Watford is asking, how do we deal with inflation? Andrew Adonis, you and I remember the days when inflation was 20% or more. I think anyone under the age of 40 looks rather quizzically when you talk about the dangers of inflation. What's your recipe for dealing with it?
Well, the Bank of England is mandated by Parliament, actually, to keep inflation low and within the range of 0 to 3%. And it has a number of tools it can use to try and bring down inflation if it gets higher, which its main tool, of course, is interest rates. And it has started putting up interest rates since the financial crash of 2008-9. Interest rates have been at a historic low. I mean, they've been zero or negative for most of that time, which, of course, has been a big driver of inflation, particularly house price inflation, which for most Brits is the most serious inflation that they face. Massive increases in house prices year on year. Now, with inflation now rising above 4%, the Bank of England has started putting up interest rates, but of course that has a big impact on people who've got to pay mortgages too. So getting this balance right is very difficult, and that's why we have an expert Bank of England to get the balance right in the rate at which you can put up interest rates without putting undue pressure on people's pay packets. The point that was raised earlier about energy prices, though, is different. That isn't being caused by inflation. That's being caused by a big spike in energy prices, way above the rise of inflation. We're faced with wholesale energy prices are going up by 40, 50, 60% at the moment, whereas inflation is only a fraction of that. And the issue about whether the government should cushion energy price rises is a very difficult one, because of course it's then moving against the market, but equally there's a limit to how big an increase in everyday living costs people can bear. And I suspect this year, 2022, one of the biggest and most difficult issues the government will face is it going to intervene to subsidise energy prices, which of course it said it would do. Boris Johnson said that energy prices would come down. I think that was quite a foolish thing to say for a Prime Minister, because he's saying that you can buck the market entirely, but he's said that. And I suspect that my party, the Labour Party, is going to do quite a good job of holding him to it.
The interesting thing, of course, is that because we are now longer members of the EU, he could actually abolish VAT on energy, which he wouldn't have been able to do in the EU. But he says he's not going to do it. Do you agree with the Labour policy of cutting the 5% rate of VAT to zero?
Well, the job of the opposition is to oppose. And when the government itself said it was going to, indeed, some of us who have longer memories remember that this is one of the main arguments that was used in the Brexit referendum, is we would have the freedom to depart from EU rules on minimum VAT rates. And we were told by Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage and all that crew that one of the first things we'd be able to do is to cut energy prices. So I've got a feeling that some chickens are coming home to roost at the moment, and I don't feel much sympathy for Boris Johnson as he tries to explain his way out of commitments that he himself gave to abolish VAT on fuel.
Robert Taylor.
Well, of course, we can abolish VAT on fuel, whereas we couldn't when we were part of the EU. So it's a tool that we have at our disposal now to tackle inflation that we couldn't have had a couple of years ago. I think that the main point to understand about the inflationary pressures is this not just a UK problem, this is a European problem, this is a global problem, essentially caused by the pandemic. And it's a short-term supply problem, basically. There's a whole lot of desire to spend now that we're coming out of a recession caused by the pandemic. So the first thing to say is not just a British problem. In fact, British inflation is below the EU rate and below the US rate at the moment. But notwithstanding any of it, we need to tackle it, and there are various tools at the government's disposal. And one of them, which I'm very pleased to say the UK government is using, is to raise the living wage in April by, I think, over 50 pence an hour. So this is well above inflation. That'll alleviate the problem for the poorest in society quite considerably. As for fuel rates and the charges people are going to pay on fuel, that's really going to hit people come April. And it's going to coincide, of course, with the national insurance rise as well. So I think the government does have to take this really seriously and look at what it can do to help those who are most vulnerable in society to make sure that they can keep the heating on. That line about heating, well, some people might find that a bit glib, but I mean, if that comes true, it will be deadly serious. And the government has to make sure, I believe is making sure, that the most vulnerable in society won't have to make that choice.
Michael tweets to say, please correct Lord Adonis, interest rates have never been zero or negative. I didn't actually hear you say that, but obviously Michael did, Andrew. That is true. They've never been zero, have they? You're muted.
Sorry, they've been exceptional. So there were two different interest rates we're talking about. We're talking the Bank of England's interest rate, which he's right, has been exceptionally low. But retail interest rates have been zero or negative, bank interest rates, and what you actually get on your savings, which tracks, of course, the Bank of England's rate. So he's correct about the Bank of England rate, but for savers, interest rates have been zero or negative in across much of the savings industry over the last 10 years.
Alex in Watford, you asked the original question. Do you have a quick solution to inflation yourself?
Well, a 4% pay rise for the nurses, that doesn't help. Bring back the old days of when you had a choice of did you have a bag of chips on Friday night or did you pay the mortgage?
You must have had a very low mortgage if you can pay it through the price of a bag of chips. OK, Alex, thank you very much for that. Penelope in Newcastle says, Emmanuel Macron has been accused of using divisive and vulgar language after he said he wanted to make life difficult for unvaccinated people, specifically saying, I really want to piss them off and will carry on doing this to the end. But isn't this exactly the right approach to dealing with idiots that refuse to get vaccinated? Well, of course, Tony Blair got into trouble, was it last week, saying that people who don't get vaccinated are idiots. Wonder whether that's the right approach to persuade people to do so. Andrew Adonis, let's start off with you as Tony Blair's biggest fan.
Well, I don't know whether the words are the right words to use, but I do think the people who are national leaders should be strongly encouraging people to get vaccinated. And I just note that today the vaccination rate in France has shot up because they've got a particular problem, a bigger problem than we have in terms of people not wishing to be vaccinated, and the rate has shot up. It clearly is the right thing to do unless you have a medical condition that makes it dangerous. It is clearly the right thing to be vaccinated for COVID in the same way as it is for polio and TB and so on. And it's clearly the right thing for national leaders to encourage people to get vaccinated.
Well,
so I don't think Macron should apologise at all.
But if you and I are having a friendly discussion about the merits or demerits of Brexit, you want to persuade me to come around to your point of view, I want to persuade you to come around to my point of view. I'm not going to do that by telling you to piss off, am I?
Well, all I would say is that isn't what's happened in France. The vaccination rate has shot up. So saying things that cut through to the public. I mean, these are judgment calls, aren't they? I might not myself have used those words, but saying things that cut through to the public on matters of huge public safety, and there's nothing more important at the moment to public safety than that people should, if there isn't a health reason for not doing so, they should get vaccinated. I don't think that Macron should apologise for using language that cuts through. It's a judgment call as to precisely what language you use, but it's clearly in all of our interests that those people who can safely do so do get vaccinated. There's no good reason whatever against doing so.
Was Tony Blair wrong to use the word idiots?
Tony Blair's never wrong.
How did I know you were going to say that? Rakib?
I think that I really do question labelling unvaccinated citizens as irresponsible, stupid, reckless, those kind of terms. I question the effectiveness of that from a public health perspective. I think that I'm generally against mandatory vaccinations. I think that persuasion and consent should be at the heart of any vaccination strategy. And really, I think that, to be honest, we should be more compassionate and understanding when it comes to looking at what underpins vaccine hesitancy. You'll see that in the British experience, vaccine hesitancy has tended to be higher within traditionally distrustful ethnic minorities. I think that also when we're looking at, there have been accounts of post-jab menstrual changes among younger women. So while Lord Adonis will have his views on how easy it is to be vaccinated or go in terms of vaccine uptake, you have to understand that within particular social groups, there are perfectly understandable forms of vaccine hesitancy. And I think that to try to address that through mandatory vaccinations, that could actually backfire. It could feel quite coercive. So I do feel
Macron, to be fair to him, has not threatened mandatory vaccinations. No. The Italian government today have said that anyone over the age of 50 will have to be vaccinated. I just wonder, on mandatory vaccinations, how do you force people to get one? But maybe that's possibly a different question. Robert Taylor.
Well, I think this is a completely cut and dried case. It's completely wrong to force people to get their vaccines. It's completely wrong to even coerce them into it. You nudge them, you persuade them, and that has been hugely successful. 70% of the British population have been vaccinated. We've got 50% of people who have had a booster vaccine, over 50%. And this is not through forcing, this is not through threatening, this is through persuading and showing people the evidence. And I'm one of them, I'm triple jabbed. The EU has only 29% on average across the whole EU who have received a booster vaccine. So we're way ahead of the EU, partly because, of course, we left the EU and therefore we're able to take our own course on vaccinations. That's one of the Brexit dividends, I would say. But the key thing is, should people have autonomy over their own bodies? I believe should. I really do. I think it's the ultimate type of freedom to decide what kind of medical procedure you're going to have. And if you don't want to have it, despite the evidence that you'll be safer and society will be safer and that it's better for everyone if you do have the vaccine, if you still don't want to, that's completely your decision and we should respect that.
Okay. Maya.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in particular with what Rakib said about different reasons that different people might not want to be vaccinated. And I think you really do have to engage with that. There may be fears around engaging in certain parts of the medical profession because of historical experiences. And so I actually think this kind of language and this kind of criticism of people who aren't vaccinated, I believe that we should all get vaccinated. And I think it is for the collective good. I got vaccinated, not just for myself, but because of all the people I'm going to come into contact with, and I want to protect those people. But I don't think that then means I should call people who are not vaccinated idiot, or I should sort of dismiss their reasons. I think it's important that we engage with them. And I don't know all the specifics of what is going on in France at the moment, but what I would say is that, the correlation and causation are two different things. And just because Macron said this and then there is now an increase in people getting the vaccine, if there is, that doesn't mean that that's a response to him saying he wants to make life difficult for people. And I think that we do have to understand that what we have to do is persuade people, and you just aren't. Maybe some people you're going to persuade by calling them an idiot, but I've very rarely been persuaded by being called a name by someone. Actually, I would rather someone engage with me on the terms of why I've made a decision I've made with, and then I do change my mind sometimes, do come around to another point of view. And I think Tony Blair was wrong to call people idiots. I think that's a wrong tack to take. And I do think I'm wary of the way that sometimes in political debate we have this sort of positioning of the so-called metropolitan elite. I think that's often a real caricature, but I do think that when politicians talk in this way, they come across as sneering and sort of not engaging with the different reasons people are making decisions they are. And so given how important the vaccine is, I think it's incumbent on politicians to just relay information, persuade people, and not to be sort of insulting them or calling them names or whatever it is you want to do.
I think it's wonderful that we don't have any idiots on our programme tonight. Thank goodness for that. And they will prove that they're just intelligent people in the next half an hour by taking more of your questions. 0345 6060 973. It's 25 to 8. News headlines on LBC with Lottie Morley.
Pre-departure COVID tests for travellers arriving in England and Wales will be scrapped from Friday. The Prime Minister told the House of Commons they're not necessary because the Omicron coronavirus variant is prevalent here. 4 people have been cleared of criminal damage after a statue of a slave trader was pulled down in Bristol in June 2020. The bronze memorial of Edward Colston was toppled during a Black Lives Matter protest before it was rolled into the harbour. Ryanair says its passenger numbers fell 7% last month when coronavirus travel restrictions returned. The airline saw the number of people on its services drop to 9.5 million. LBC weather, showers for coastal areas in the west, north and east this evening, with highs of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:38, let me reintroduce the panel. Lord Andrew Adonis, which I'm told you can never say Lord Andrew Adonis. It's either Labour peer Andrew Adonis or, well, anyway, does it matter? Dr. Maya Goodfellow is author of Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats. Is it selling well, Maya?
Yep, obviously.
Yeah, I thought you might say that. And Robert Taylor, journalist, commentator and Telegraph contributor, and Dr. Rakib Ehsan, research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and political commentator. Next call is from Mark in Sevenoaks. Hello, Mark.
Hello. David Frost and the Office of Budget Responsibility have said that Brexit is costing the average earner about £1,000 a year. Do people want to take advantage of the EU's policy to allow the undoing of Brexit to recover this money?
What, you mean that the EU would let us rejoin on our original terms?
That is what they told me when they had an office in Smith Square. They said that it was not time limited either by actually leaving or by the end of the transition period.
I'm not sure that they would allow us to rejoin on those terms. But anyway, Rakib Ehsan, let's start with you.
I think that in terms of what the government, in terms of using Brexit as potentially a catalyst for sort of democratic, economic and social renewal, I think that's, if they did have those plans in place, that has been somewhat scuppered by the pandemic. But I think that much of this talk, and I know that Lord Adonis will definitely disagree with me on this, I think that just any talk of rejoining the European Union I think it's not constructive in the slightest. And it was very interesting that before the UK's referendum on EU membership, there was a strong association between being dissatisfied with democracy, not being particularly trusting of institutions, and voting to leave the European Union. So I feel that if you were to remarkably reverse that decision, essentially reverse the results of the referendum, you would be just plunging those particular group of voters back into a pool of political disaffection, which I think that it would fundamentally undermine the health of our democracy. So I think much of this talk of rejoining the EU, I think that the discussion now needs to move towards how we can strike common ground between Remain voters and Leave voters, and how we can make the best in terms of making post-Brexit Britain a success.
And Maya, it was interesting that Keir Starmer, in his big speech yesterday, one of the key lines was, we need to make Brexit work. No talk from him, and he was considered, I think, possibly along with Andrew, as one of the main cheerleaders for reversing Brexit. What do you make of Mark's question?
Yeah, I mean, on Keir Starmer, absolutely, he did sort of play that role when he was in the shadow cabinet, and now I guess is making the electoral calculation that it's not wise to be advocating for rejoining the EU. Listen, I am not happy about the direction the current government is taking the UK in, but I'm also in no way a sort of arch defender of the EU. It obviously has many problems, not least the way it treats many of the people who are trying to make it across the Mediterranean to seek asylum in Europe. But I think that people who feel incredibly strongly about Britain's membership of the EU are well within their rights to continue to campaign for rejoining. I don't think it's not going to have much sort of political space in the coming years, because I think there are very few parties that are going to want to sort of stake that put their sort of flag in the sand and say that that's the direction we want to go in. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if in the next 10 years or 20 years it sort of resurfaces. As much as I don't want to talk about this anymore, I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't necessarily disappear as a political issue, because so many people place certain kinds of value on remaining in the EU or leaving the EU in a way that has a lot of emotional salience for people, I think. But one of the things I would say is that, you know, at what point is Brexit done? Will we ever be able to call Brexit finished? And how do we determine that and define that? And I think actually a lot of this debate will continue to grapple over what exit looks like, because it's not immediately clear that it's going to suddenly crystallise and we're going to be in this sort of post-EU Britain, and we're going to be able to clearly define what that is.
Andrew Adonis, I'm sure you have a view.
Well, Brexit clearly isn't working, and that's what the public think. There was a poll out yesterday, Ipsos Mori, that showed that 54% think that Brexit is going very badly, and only 34% think it's going well. And if the public had had a chance to have a second referendum on the terms of Brexit, because remember when the first referendum was held, it was just an idea that we might seek to leave the EU. If there'd been a referendum on the terms of Brexit, it's my view that there would have been a decisive majority against leaving. Instead, what we had was a general election in 2019, which was a choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. And it was no surprise to anyone, including Labour politicians like me, that people didn't want Jeremy Corbyn. So this isn't finished business so far as the public's concerned. Indeed, it isn't finished business so far as the government's concerned. You know, I've spent the last year shadowing Lord Frost, David Frost, who was the Brexit minister. He walked out of the government before Christmas in the middle of negotiations, which he had himself started to reopen his own Brexit deal because it's not working in Northern Ireland. There's a crisis in trade between Britain and Northern Ireland caused by his own Brexit deal because of the requirement to keep an open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which means that there are now controls, really serious trade controls between Great Britain, the mainland, and Northern Ireland. So the government doesn't think Brexit's working. The minister responsible for Brexit has resigned after less than a year in the post. The public doesn't think Brexit is working. I don't think that this is sustainable, and it's only a matter of time before we have to renegotiate the Brexit deal and get fundamentally closer to the European Union again, and in particular to re-enter the customs union and the single market, so we don't have these massive impediments to trade, which is what is causing such serious economic damage to us at the moment.
Now, Robert Taylor, before you answer the question, several people on text and Twitter are picking you up on your claim that our vaccination programme is only so good because we aren't in the EU. They say it's patent rubbish.
Well, we could have stayed in the EU vaccination programme as members of the EU, but in practice we wouldn't have done. In practice, anyone who is a member of the EU stayed in the EU vaccination programme. That's the point. Whereas because we were out of the EU, we followed a different path. That is the key point to make about the vaccination programme. As for Brexit, look, we did out. We voted to be an independent country in 2016. It was a clear majority, 52-48. If Lord Adonis remembers this, but he and I had a bet on Twitter, 3 or 4 months ago, about whether there would be another referendum in the next 10 years. I sort of had a bet that we wouldn't. I think Lord Adonis said that we would. I offered a £10
He'll
bet.
block you before then.
Reply to that.
I think I took the bet, actually, Robert, didn't I?
Did you take the bet? I don't recall.
I can't remember what odds.
Anyway, the point is, the question from David, so it was Mark, wasn't it? Was that Brexit is costing £1,000 a year per person. I don't know quite how he comes up with that, but let's just look at the Treasury forecasts for what would happen if we left the EU or if we just vote out. These were the Treasury forecasts as to what could happen. GDP would be down by 3.6% within 2 years of the vote to leave. Wages would be 3% lower. There would be 500,000 jobs lost. The pound would fall by 12%. Home prices would fall by 10%, and government borrowing could increase by £24 billion.
Yeah, but you can't run away from the fact that there have been, as Andrew Adonis says, there have been problems, particularly with Northern Ireland, and it was Boris Johnson and David Frost that negotiated that, and it's not working. They knew it wouldn't work. It couldn't work.
Well, the Northern Ireland situation is a particularly difficult situation. You've got Northern Ireland having an open border with the Republic of Ireland, but still being part of the UK. That was always going to cause problems. But if you look at the overall Brexit situation, we were told that Nissan would leave. We were told that Airbus would leave. We were told that Siemens would leave. We were told that we wouldn't be able to do trade with the EU. All these things have actually transpired not to be true at all. In fact, according to the OECD, we're going to be the fastest growing economy in the G7 in 2022. How can we achieve that?
Because ours was worst affected by COVID, so inevitably,
but
then
how
surely
would we achieve that? We came out of the EU just a year ago. How are we going to have the fastest growth in the G7 if Brexit was going to cause such a disaster? In other words, Project Fear was, to say the least, misleading.
But why
thank you very much. No, Andrew, I have to go to a break because I'm already 4 minutes late, which is why I'm not going to come back to Mark in Sevenoaks, but I think from his question we can guess what his views are. More of your calls in just a moment. It's 8:49.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
The number of signatures on the petition to stop Tony Blair becoming Sir Tony Blair stands at 693,000. Former British Army officer Colonel Tim Collins. When you heard the news of the elevation of Tony Blair, what was your reaction, Colonel?
If he's any decency, he'll say, I feel that the right thing to do is to decline it, A, on the basis of what has gone before and the consequences of my decision making. And secondly, during my tenure, I worked so hard to undermine the institution of the monarchy, it would be a nonsense for me to accept a personal gift from the monarch.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
A few
Ask Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:52, we have a text question from Dawn in Warwick. She says, Pope Francis says couples who choose pets over having children are selfish. Is he right? That's an interesting one. I suppose he's concerned about the population declining a bit and that some people just stop after one child. I think I read that in some of his comments earlier. Maya Goodfellow, is Pope Francis, has he got a point?
No, I don't, in a word. I mean, reading his comments, one of the things that he said that this practice of people having pets over children is a denial of fatherhood and motherhood and takes us away our humanity. And I think there's a few things here. One is that obviously people don't just sort of have their humanity and support other people by having children. We do this in lots of other ways as well. Whilst I am someone who has a cat, for full disclosure, so I'm one of the pet owning many, I do disagree with his comment, but I do think that I sometimes wish that some of the people that I encountered in my life had as much sort of love and care for the other human beings they interact with as they do their pets. So I try to treat other human beings as well as I treat my cat. But I think one of the things here is obviously there is an issue in terms of aging populations. But if we're going to look at a country like the UK, for instance, many people make the sort of decision to not have children or to put off having children for a number of different reasons. But one reason can be that they're worried about the affordability of it all. So if you know, for those people who don't have children because they feel like they can't afford to, then I think that's a real discussion to have. But I am not into bashing people who have pets because I am one of those people.
I think we need full pet disclosure from the other panelists as well. Rakib, let's go to you.
I think I'd really follow on Maya's point. I think that I'd imagine there are young people in Britain who quite like the idea of getting married, having children of their own, a family building essentially, but they don't feel particularly confident in their own financial situation to really take on that part of life. So I think that we have to have a more nuanced discussion and understand why perhaps there may well be young people who are completely, they're not interested at all in having children of their own, but that there may well be the possibility that we do have young people who may, for example, also be saddled with large amounts of student debt, for example. They might not feel confident enough in their own financial situation to really confidently enter the stage where they would like to get married, have children and build a family of their own.
You've neatly avoided the pet disclosure question.
I don't see that. I don't see why it has to be a check. You can have pets and you can also build a family.
No, but do you have one?
I used to have a Yorkshire Terrier, sadly no longer with us, but he was extremely good fun to be around.
Robert?
Yeah, I agree with the panelists. It's a ridiculous thing, I think, for Pope Francis to say, calling people selfish for not having children. It's their own personal choice, for heaven's sake. It's no business of his to get involved. Is he trying to create headlines? I've got no idea. It was an extraordinary story that I saw earlier today. Just keep out of it. It's no business of yours, Pope Francis, I think I would say.
Do you have a pet?
I personally have a pet. No, I don't. They make me sneeze. But I'd love to have a pet. It certainly wouldn't be because Pope Francis said something that I would decide not to.
Andrew Adonis.
Well, all I can say is that only somebody who doesn't have children, like the Pope, could think there's any conflict between having children and having pets. Full disclosure, I've had 2 dogs, and they've both been because of my children. And there is no greater campaigner for dogs inside families than daughters in particular. There comes a point around the age of sort of 10, 11, where the campaign is absolutely relentless, and you're sort of a pretty brave father who tries to hold out against the having of a pet. So I think he doesn't understand really how the relationship between humans and animals, curiously. I thought that was something which religious people did understand. I don't think he understands them. They do go together. There is a natural affinity. And could I make one other point too? We're just coming out of this appalling COVID crisis, where lots of people have been very lonely. particularly elderly people who've been on their own, often not able to see their relations. And for many elderly people in particular, having pets, and in particular having cats and dogs, has made the difference between having some form of communion, use a religious term, some form of communion with others, and being totally isolated with all of the depression and frankly horror that goes with that. So I don't understand why a religious leader who is concerned about the well-being of his flock could think that that pets, who are often the difference between people being happy and unhappy in their lives, why this is a bad thing.
I've never agreed with you more than in that last answer. Thank you very much indeed for that text, Dawn. A little fun one now from Dave in Wells Next to the Sea in Norfolk. Lovely place. Meghan Markle has received £1 in damages from the Mail on Sunday. What should she spend it on? Short answers, please. Robert Taylor.
Well, if she can spend it on keeping out of the limelight, I'm not quite sure how she can do that. But if she could, I think that would be great. It was a serious point. She's got mental health issues, as she says. I believe her. So has Harry. Less of them, not more, in 2022 would be good, I think, for all of us and for them.
Andrew Adonis.
She should buy the big issue when she next visits London.
I think it's more than £1, isn't it? Maya.
I would say as many Sherbet Dib Dabs as that'll get you, because why not?
I would say possibly Gobstoppers.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I would fine. Either.
Rakib.
A lot of Freddos. I used to really like Freddos when I was growing up. So if I had £1 spare, I'd get a lot of them.
I don't even know what is a Freddo.
Oh, you're missing out, Ian. I can't believe that.
Well,
it's very nice. It's very nice.
Okay, Robbie's going to bring me one in tomorrow, he says. It's probably something very bad for me, I imagine. Listen, it's been a great cross question. Thank you very much indeed to you all. Rakib Ehsan, Robert Taylor, Andrew Adonis and Maya Goodfellow. Just a reminder, Maya's book is called Hostile Environment, How Immigrants Became Scapegoats. And Andrew, your latest book is called?
It's the Leaders Stupid, Political Leaders in Democracies.
And Rakib, you've got a book coming out, I believe.
I do. It's called Beyond Grievance. So it's essentially talking about the growing tensions between the modern British left and traditional ethnic minorities living in the UK.
Heavy stuff. Robert, have you got a book coming out? And if not, why not?
I haven't. I should think of one, shouldn't I?
I think you should.
It should be one about pets, don't you think?
Now, that's the one I'd like to write. Thank you very much indeed. If you missed any of Cross Question, you can catch up on Global Player and on the LBC YouTube channel. In a moment, we're going to talk about what we've just talked about on Cross Question, actually, the Edward Colston statue, the 4 people who were let off by a jury today. They were found not guilty of causing criminal damage, and they won't face any further charges at all. Was that the right decision by the jury, accepting, of course, that none of us were in court? But what message does this verdict send out? And if there was a statue that you'd like to rip down, which one would it be? You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. Prosecutors have urged the judge who presided over the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell to conduct an inquiry into a juror's reported claims that he was a victim of sexual abuse. Maxwell was found guilty last week of conspiring to recruit and groom teenage girls to be sexually abused by their financier Jeffrey Epstein. LBC's Washington correspondent Simon Marks has the details.
This relates to juror Scotty David,